But let's suppose what's really happening now is we actually have a shift from Homo sapien to Homo faber. That is to say, I've moved from just abstract knowledge to a sense of knowing that has come by doing, and a sense of knowing that comes from making. Now, if you think about this from this point of view, all of a sudden the things that we tend to believe are just distractions. For example, what is happening with our net generation kids today? Well, by the way, what the net generation kids are doing is they are engaging in a phenomenal amount of building. They're building videos, they're building their own music, they're building their own photography, they're building their own devices, and so on and so forth. We don't think of that as being part of becoming a Homo sapien. But maybe in this rapidly changing world, and maybe exactly the meta-strategic shift that we really want to honor in this country, what actually originally made this country so great, is this willingness to go out and constantly build things. But now the building has to do with things as much virtual or physically augmented virtuality or virtually augmented physicality, and of course stressing the notion of the social. I want to go one step further. It may just be the case that under the Homo sapien point of view, we think of tools as instruments. What if that's just the beginning of how we should think about tools? I don't know how many craftspeople, I don't know how many artists, I don't know how many material scientists there are in this room, but there's another way to look at tools. Tools not as instruments, but tools that actually talk back to us as we try to make things happen. If you are a sculptor, you are working with tools on material and there's ability to talk back to you and to reflect on what is saying back to you that actually creates a conversation between you and the world. As a material scientist, the way we lay down one atom layers in terms of some of our new ability to build materials in the nano world, you have to listen to the way that those tools, that nature is pushing back at you. As a circuit designer trying to push circuits faster and faster and faster, you start to worry about how the hell does this electron figure out how to get around this corner and what's it saying back to you when it gets confused. These are the things that craftspeople, which is the basis of almost all science and art at one level, coupled to a kind of sense of aesthetics, is not the tool as instrument. It is a tool of an extension of yourself that becomes a very interesting learning artifact. I don't know how many of you try to make movies, but you talk to these kids in terms of the ways they build anime, very interesting movement around the world, again done by marginalized kids, but incredibly attractive, or even how the kids that are designing hip-hop type music. And what's happening? Take hip-hop. They're picking up a phrase. They're like poets. They play with that phrase over and over again. The phrase talks back to them. They talk about that phrase. If that phrase ends up feeling right to them, lo and behold, it will appear in one of their songs. So it's a sense of working with the world, and the tools become the mediators of conversation between the world and you. This is what is happening, but we are ignoring it. And the world of the virtual, the world of the digital, is blowing open our ability to do this for virtually every single student and every single workforce person, if you kind of begin to understand what this transformation is really about. Of course, this brings back a notion of tinkering, a topic dear to not only myself, but Patrick here in his Design Institute. Thinking about this, many of us in this room that turned out to be scientists or engineers of one form or another, and actually probably successful business people, got our intuitions by tinkering. I don't know about you, but I spent a great deal of time tinkering with radios, transmitters, motorcycles, automobiles, and I'll tell you, my parents and my grandparents were absolutely convinced I was wasting all my time. But they had no idea, of course I didn't either, but I had no idea that that was forming the basis of kind of an intuition that then enabled me to take abstract, decontextualized knowledge, or even certain problem sets, and embed it in an experiential field that never left me. And it was that tinkering that formed kind of the semantic basis for being able to encode new ideas and enabled me to embrace change and not be afraid of it. Because I had that foundation of things never working like they should, not being afraid of that, saying those were problems, and so on and so forth. But guess what happened? Starting around 1980, therefore today's kids that were coming up at that time, that particular period from 1980 to about 1995, tinkering disappeared. It went off the face of the map. Why? Well, one reason is it's very, very hard to open up this watch and repair it. Believe me, I've tried. It's even worse trying to open up your car and work on increasing the horsepower of your car. And in fact, guess what? Those of you that are digitally illiterate, there is a way to do it. I know. But guess what? At least in California, they had to pass a law and say, you are not allowed to tinker with your car anymore, Mr. JSB, because we're going to do smog tests, and we're going to see that you just changed the timing of your car, blah, 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 okay? And when we found out that they were going to therefore test our cars, we figured out at what RPMs they were going to be testing these cars. And there was no trouble to hack the hacked tables and put in retrogression timers at exactly those places. And then they got really angry. They said, we're going to make a law. I believe it's a serious law now in California to say you can't even try to do that. They've also made it more difficult because they do variable load testing, which actually makes it very difficult to do this particular hack. But nevertheless, that was the state. So everybody stopped tinkering to a very large extent. And by the way, tinkering to a reasonable extent was kind of gender specific. Not totally, but in many ways. Then what happened? Starting about the mid-90s, tinkering came back full scale. How's that? In the virtual world, first of all, you are encouraged to always mod things. Consider open source. Open source is a fundamental process of modifying things. Think about mashups. Think about what your kids do day in and day out. They don't just build playlists, they do mashups of the music and so on. So in the virtual world, there's all kinds of creative tinkering that's starting to happen. And in fact, the virtual world screams out for tinkering. And we never kind of recognized that as a new type of learning platform. But more recently, I have learned so much about light shading for the camera people and photography by actually getting in there with Photoshop and tinker. You begin to pick up a lot of understanding of things that I never had the ability to really understand. And don't forget, I come from Xerox, where we build color printers, so I know a lot about color, but it wasn't until you got back to tinkering that you began to really understand what this was like. So we have a new realm. One more simple example of kind of this passion-based, interest-based types of niches that are developing. And for example, if you do photography, you'd be astounded at the forums and what those forums can do to kind of train you and let you understand more and more and more deep knowledge about digital photography. But let me go on. Again, in terms of the sense of new kinds of learning institutions, obviously where I'm headed from the basis of instruction, the one many, to the peer-based, interest-driven groups. What are the shifts that are happening? Because basically in the classroom, we worry about assessment. But in these peer-based interest groups, we do talk about feedback. We do talk about reviews. Likewise, in the kind of peer-based groups, we're constantly sharing, and we're constantly building recommendations for each other. That is the way I pick up most of what I know today. And instead of worried about standardization, we're worried about specialization in terms of these peer groups, because the peer groups form around highly specialized issues. Think about it a moment. We probably train today 1 million students in software through open source projects, such as Linux, JBoss, Apache, and hundreds more.